Well, welcome to the Composable DXP with Uniform Bootcamp course, lesson number 4, the DXP Tech Stack Overview, presented by Tim Bennix, Principal Developer Advocate at Uniform. If you want to learn more about him, just watch the great interview I did with him in the introduction section of this course on headlesscreator.com. With that said, I'm going to get Tim here. Tim, welcome. Glad to have you back. For those of you watching live, you've got a comments area. Type your questions there. And Tim, it's all yours.
All righty, thank you very much. All right, so today we are talking about the DXP tech stack and its overview. And I actually want to talk about that because if you look at the DNA of a composable architecture, the technical choices that you have and should make are quite different than how you would make them originally, basically. And so it is important because if you go to the next slide, oh yeah, my camera is a bit overlapping the words. There you go. Thank you, Marcelo. We are living in a composable world, and I've put this slide in a couple of decks already, and it's pretty important thinking about this because what we are doing currently is we are living in an origin-less era. And what I mean by that is the fact that traditionally lots of systems had an origin server, which would be the center of the universe of your architecture, right? So your CMS would talk to it and say, okay, this is the data for that URL, and then your it would go to the database and it would come back to it, and it would be the web server and come back to it. And every time a page needed to be rendered, it would go to the origin server. That's where all the magic happened. Took a while, then it comes back, page is rendered. And nowadays, we don't really have this anymore. It's much closer to actually decentralizing everything. And so it's composed. And so, with that in mind, how are you going to host your front end? What kind of architecture are you going to use if you don't have this central server anymore where this front end can live? Right. And so, as the slide says, this is the new era of origin-less. And so, we don't have a center of the universe anymore. And so, if you look, this is a slide from 2020, I think. So, it's quite old. And these are all the players in our space that are doing headless related things, composable stuff. And so there must be thousands of products here that are all API first, component driven, without an origin, with their own CDN instance, basically. And so we get to pick and choose from all of these and then build our composable DXP. And so everything on that list that we just saw is API first, right? And so if you look at how we did it traditionally, like I just outlined a little bit, we have the client that then talks to the web server, that then talks to the application server, that then talks to databases and CMSs and other things. And as you can see, it's actually built up. So if one of these things doesn't work, the whole tower will collapse and everything just dies. And the thing is, this is nice and easy to understand, but it's also quite limiting and challenging because if you want to scale something up, you have to clone this whole thing and then make sure that they are in sync together. That's quite challenging. But you want to see something that's actually more challenging? This. This is the modern web, right? Where we don't have that chain of things because we don't have this origin anymore. So they don't depend on each other. They're almost more like interlinked or interconnected. And so you have multiple web services that all have their own CDNs, and on the CDNs, magical things happen. And you have other places with different web servers that have all their own things, and you have multiple endpoints because you don't have just a website now. You might also have an app, or you might be showing something on a train station, whatever. There's multiple endpoints, multiple clients, but nothing goes to the one thing that knows everything. So how do you then actually host your front end, and how do you manage everything and orchestrate it? Well, like this. How do we actually build a site in this origin-less world? We use the Jamstack, and lots of traditionalists might not like these words because they might not be used to what the Jamstack actually is. And isn't this just like this super fancy hip kids front end thing? No, it's actually not. It's much more than that. And it's almost like how you build websites now. And the best thing is that the Jamstack is basically a modern web architecture, or a development architecture based on client-side JavaScript, reusable APIs, and pre-built markup. And the funny thing is, when you read this kind of sounds like how we used to build websites, but there's a pretty big difference because,
Real quick question on
um,
that.
yeah,
If you
shoot.
go back the slide, because one of the things is like then people can go and like, okay, it's JavaScript, but I'm not a JavaScript developer, and I thought the promise of API first and composables, I can pick whatever I want, right? But Jamstack, I think, is sort of an architecture that started with JavaScript, but I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong because you know this stuff better than I do, but I believe with Jamstack now you can use different languages, correct? It's more of the
Oh, you
architecture as
clearly
opposed to
can.
just JavaScript.
And you know what's the interesting thing is that I think when these types of architecture started, it wasn't with JavaScript. We used, ooh, it's a while back. I'm a bit lost for what the name is again, but it used to run on GitHub pages back in the day,
Got it.
which actually was, oh, I'm stumped for words because it's so long ago. But these systems for GitHub pages, they would create you a Jamstack website, and the J of JavaScript was out. It didn't exist then. That only came a bit later because JavaScript was so much more prevalent. And you Jamstack, in the end, what it comes down to is the word pre-built markup, right? That's what it in the end comes down to. The fact that you pre-build things and then serve them on the CDN, so not on this origin. And however you pre-build this thing, I don't care. You can use JavaScript. You don't even have to use APIs. In the end of the M of Jamstack is the only thing you need.
Got it.
But there's so many variations because you can also do Jamstack without pre-built stuff, but it's a single page app that does Ajax calls and creates the HTML on the fly, but not runtime of a server. Then what is it? Is it Jamstack? Maybe. Right? So it's kind of a volatile term that goes all over the place.
Right. So I think the key takeaway here is don't get stuck on JavaScript, get stuck on the methodology and the framework
Exactly.
of how you deliver pages as opposed to like, wait a minute, I don't do JavaScript, why do I have to do this now, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the thing is, right now, lots of these bigger meta frameworks that are front end driven, like Nuxt or Next or Gatsby, they all use JavaScript because it's so easy to use and there's so
Right.
many people, but you don't need it. And so let's go a little bit back to the slides to like the crux of what this Jamstack thing actually is, because we are doing certain things on build time and other things on runtime. And this is where it's significantly different from what it used to be, right? And so all the kind of API calls, data mapping, queries that you do, dynamic things that normally take time from a server, you do this during build. So you literally say, okay, my code is done or my content is gone. I hit save, and then the CI/CD stack, your build tool chain, will actually notice that difference either from content or from, let's say, your Git repository, and it will notice this different and then start, like maybe even it starts up a Docker, it builds your whole system, and whatever comes out of that gets uploaded to a place on the CDN edge. And what comes out is a pre-built website, like we had in the early 2000s, where we all built HTML files and FTP'd them somewhere. Well, now we've kind of like supercharged how we do that with really fancy new tools, plus a bunch of things in between that make it more fancy with hydration of JavaScript and other things. But essentially, we have basically made this system where we would build simple websites like about us.html, blah, blah, blah. That would then be uploaded somewhere. We have now supercharged that with great front end tools, great developer experience, and then it would be put on a CDN, right? And the client, so the end user that goes to this website, actually browses static HTML files. And of course, not everything is completely static, but we'll get there in a second. But this is just a paradigm shift from an older paradigm, right? You can see that the tech world is going up and down in different things. And it's just right place, right time for Jamstack right now because it can live on the CDN. It doesn't have to be on an origin server. And so basically, just coming back to it, in the traditional web, you have all these steps that it has to do, and the page is basically white while it's doing all these steps, so you're waiting for the page to come back up again. And if you then go to Jamstack, it doesn't have to do all these pages because these steps. It just goes to the CDN and comes back, and the page is there because it's already built. And then, of course, there are also web services around that you might query once the page is there, right? You might want to show a product, and the product is pre-rendered because you know that product is there on that page. But the stock and the price might actually be fluid, right? Because these things change. So you could then do an AJAX call to one of these web services that gives you back the stock, or it gives you back how much it costs, or how much discount you could get based on your profile. And then it just enriches it.
So this addresses that question of, well, Jamstack is always static and my page is dynamic. I want to, so this one is basically you're saying we get the static page from CDN, but then we can hydrate it with dynamic data through web services.
Exactly. And we'll get into that dynamicism a little bit more later. And this is where sometimes it gets a bit complicated because the hybrid approach is always the best result, but it's the hardest to get.
Right.
Right? Because the fastest page is just static, black and white, nothing on it. But the best performing page for conversions and people want to buy something is super rich and enriched with some data later on. But that is kind of hard to do. And so you can also go full force further down and have everything dynamic as a single page application where the whole thing lives in JavaScript. But then it's less fast on first page loads because then the HTML is not there. So it first has to download all the JavaScript. It has to do some smart things in the browser, query some things, and then build you the page. So in between these two is generally your sweet spot, but it's pretty darn hard to get. Luckily, these meta frameworks out there for Next and Nuxt and Remix Run, for example, is a great version for that nowadays, or SvelteKit. They take the sting out of how complicated that is and help you with it. And that's why the Jamstack is so tied to JavaScript frameworks now, because they just do it for you. And now you don't have to have all the knowledge that I have to actually build a great website, because I came up when we didn't have this. I came up in this FTP time and we just had index.html, right? And then we went through all the steps to get here. And now all that knowledge sits in these new meta frameworks. And that's really cool. But like you said just now, Marcelo, it seems awfully static, right? And so other than doing JavaScript related things to make it more dynamic, there's also two more things we can look at. And this is the great thing about composable DXP or Mac Alliance like technology, or however you want to call it. CDNs are amping up what they can do. Like back in the day, a CDN was just a caching layer. And then CDN started to do maybe DNS routing for you, or domain name hosting, or DDoS protection. And then they started to do other things. And now they're so far in that on the CDN edge, and the edge is the thing that's the closest to you as the user, they can start to do things like edge compute, or they can run serverless functions. And so let's get into these a little bit. Edge compute has different names in different places, but what it essentially does is when you load one of these static HTML pages, right? Before it loads that page on the CDN edge, there's some smartness going on, which actually routes the user through something that's dynamic, some sort of functionality, like on the edge. And you can generally choose the language, and we tend to choose JavaScript or Node.js. It goes through that. And then if you don't do anything, it just renders the HTML. But if you wanted to, you can change the stream of HTML that is rendered on the page through that function. So you can check, hey, these are the cookies that that user has. Let me now do something. Or maybe in the